Hello, this is a practice for a presentation that I'm going to give tomorrow at a conference. So I have 20 minutes for the conference practice or for the conference presentation, and I'm going to be using a script for this to make sure that I can stick to that time, hopefully. And I'm going to go ahead and practice that now. This is the continuation of my project on Cordoba that I started last semester. So without further ado, I will begin this talk entitled Identity and Power in Independent Cordoba During the 5th and 6th Centuries. The transition of Western Europe from the Roman Empire to other kingdoms constitutes a major theme in late antique study. In particular, scholars investigate the way in which people changed from being Romans to new peoples formed from both immigrants and the existing population. Much of this study has broadly summarized conditions across Western Europe, examined famous locations, or looked at groups based on their later power and influence, such as the Merovingian Franks. These studies include aspects of power and identity. By focusing in on a particular place for a specified time, one can see more clearly how identity and power functioned and related to each other in this period. During the 5th and 6th centuries, the city of Cordoba in modern-day Spain provides an excellent opportunity for such study. By the late 5th century AD, the imperial administration had collapsed. Visigoths, one of the people who had entered the empire, carved out a kingdom based mostly in modern-day France in the 5th century. After tribulations during most of the 6th century, including losing almost all of their French territory, the Visigoths established a kingdom that ruled nearly the entire Iberian Peninsula. Two texts form the basis for the information on Cordoba in this context. First, Isidore of Seville in his Historia Gothorum Vandalorum Sueborum states that in the year 550, moving against the city of Cordoba in battle, Aguila, in contempt of the Catholic religion, inflicted injury on the church of the most blessed martyr Asisclus. This profane man polluted the sacred site of Asisclus's tomb with the horror of his enemies and their horses when he began his struggle against the Cordoban citizens. He deserved the punishments brought by the saints. Struck in vengeance during the same war, he lost both his son, who was killed there, along with a large part of the army, and his entire treasury with its remarkable riches. Second, John of Beclara's Chronicon records for the year 572, King Leovigild seized by night the city of Cordoba, which had been in rebellion from the Goths for a long time. He slaughtered the enemy troops and made it his own. Scholars often tell the story of late antique Spain, including Cordoba, through the lens of the faltering imperial center or the rising successor kingdom. This approach for analyzing late antique Spain has been recognized as insufficient among scholars. Within this viewpoint, current historiography often portrays Cordoba as having little importance until an abrupt uprising in 550 against the Visigoths. To complete the traditional narrative, though initially successful in obtaining independence, Cordoba again succumbed to the Visigoths in 572. I will demonstrate that the people in Cordoba did not suddenly become political actors in 550, but held a distinctive identity as a community, which I will call the Cordoban community. A civic identity unified the Cordobans and played a central role in the formation of the Cordoban communal identity, although people in the city also had religious and ethnic identities. Furthermore, I will argue that Cordoba maintained its political independence from the disintegration of Roman authority in Spain until their defeat in 572, meaning that the Cordoban identity also represented a political identity in the 5th and 6th centuries. A few scholars have previously speculated about or asserted the political autonomy of cities in southern Spain in late antiquity, including Cordoba. My analysis of Cordoba's autonomy, however, by focusing on identity at the scale of the city and its community, will enable me to respond to the calls for a new historical narrative of post-Roman Spain and will provide widely applicable insights about the relationship of power and identity formation within urban communities. Both Isidore of Seville and John of Beclara wrote in the 7th century after nearly the entire Iberian Peninsula had been united under the Visigoths. Both writers promoted this picture of unity in their accounts. Additionally, both authors chose to promote unity under the state even when it ran contrary to their other beliefs. For example, during a civil war from 579 to 584, Hermenegild, the son of King Leovigild, believed in the same Christian doctrines as both Isidore and John. No mention of this fact occurred in their texts, though. Instead, despite often lamenting King Leovigild's belief in a different Christian creed, both authors portray Hermenegild negatively as a disruptor of the unity of Spain. Thus, both authors made choices to prioritize unity under the Visigoths over other possible emphases. Additionally, the depiction of people or cities as rebels may be projecting their contemporary situation of a more unified Spain backward into their accounts. Further, Isidore's narration simply says that Aguila attacked Cordoba without referring to any rebellion on the part of its inhabitants, and this omission is significant because he gives other details of the campaign, such as the death of King Aguila's son. John of Beclara's account is the only one that specifically calls the conflict of Cordoba and the Visigoths a rebellion. This entry, however, does not give an exact date for the beginning of the rebellion. While John could have 550 in mind, he just as well could be referring to some unrecorded political maneuverings in the 5th century or earlier in the 6th century. These sources do bring up three aspects of the Cordoban community: its independence opposed the Goths, its possession of places of religious significance, and its urban nature. Thus, one can identify three possible identities that contributed to the autonomy of the Cordoban community: ethnic, religious, and civic. These identities contributed to a community identity that empowered the Cordobans to define and defend their city. Though often conflated, one can define power as the opposite of force. In this argument, power exists where people, for cultural, personal, or other reasons, willingly follow a leader or institution. Force instead entails bending people to one's will by threats and violence. The Cordobans did not define their community ethnically. While one might think that former Romans and Goths formed clearly defined and differentiated groups, recent scholarship has made it clear that labels such as Roman or Gothic pertain to more or less than ethnicity depending on the context and are not mutually exclusive terms. Someone who fought in the army of the Gothic king while ethnically identifying as Roman could be considered a Goth. For example, the nobleman Claudius, the Duke of the city Merida, was of noble birth and Roman stock. This quote shows someone included among the Visigothic nobility, though still identified by Roman descent. Marriages also occurred between the local populace and the immigrant peoples. Immigrant peoples in the 5th and 6th centuries moved through southern Spain before the area became part of the Visigothic kingdom, and an inscription reveals the presence of Visigothic people living in and around Cordoba from the very start of the 6th century. These circumstances demonstrate that the local elites could incorporate new members from different ethnicities into the existing community. The Visigoths, like many immigrant peoples, officially adhered to the Homoian Christian creed as set forth in the Council of Rimini in 359. But the Romans held to the doctrines laid out by the Council of Nicaea in 325 and the Nicene Creed, which is still used by many Christians today. Therefore, an argument goes that to be a Roman meant to be a Nicaean, and to be a Goth meant to be Homoian. According to these arguments, rather than ethnic or military labels, one can read references to Goths and Romans in the primary sources as reflections of the religious divide between the Christian sects. Individuals, however, clearly have the label of both Gothic ethnicity and Nicene Christianity applied to them in the sources, such as the example of Masona, the bishop, shown on the slide. While some argue such passages only describe Gothic Nicaeans because they are an anomaly in this period, this argument again works better if one has already accepted that a divide exists. Thus, differences in either religious or ethnic identity would not have prevented the formation of a Cordoban community. The civic identity of Cordobans provided a source of unification. In the Roman Empire, the city and its surrounding territory formed the basic administrative unit, the civitas. The cities were run by local elites who followed the directives of the imperial administration. While imperial administrators outranked these elites, the locals ruled the day-to-day affairs within their own city or town. Substantial evidence exists that the administration and leadership of cities under the local nobility in the former imperial territories continued in the areas of civil councils, law, and elite social relations into the late antique period. Other cities from the period similarly display a powerful civic identity, acting in their local interests over other ties and relationships. Thus, even as the Western Empire fell, the faces, or at least the forms of local power, did not change much in cities such as Cordoba. The local material conditions of Cordoba also framed the interactions of the Cordoban community. With the loss of imperial resources and expertise, almost all cities shrunk as amenities and protection ceased to be provided regularly, and some cities and towns disappeared altogether. While Cordoba did undergo some of this reduction, the city retained its status as one of the foremost cities in Spain by maintaining part of its sewer system, an aqueduct, and some public buildings in which local elites could formally discuss and make decisions. Also, archaeological evidence for trade from across the Mediterranean Sea exists, albeit in reduced scale. Thus, the Cordoban community existed in a material context that maintained classic urban amenities and provided the spaces for local government to continue. The religious identity within the Cordoban community overlapped with the civic identity. Christianity already featured in local administration in the late empire, especially through the bishops. Bishop Hosius, a famous advisor of Emperor Constantine, resided in Cordoba in the 4th century, making the link to Christianity particularly strong in the city. The archaeological evidence shows that Cordoba likely became Christianized relatively early in the 3rd century, and the local community built and maintained pilgrimage sites dedicated to martyrs from Cordoba. The complex dedicated to St. Aquisclus, mentioned in the text of Isidore of Seville, formed the most notable of these sites. One other major building complex existed on the northern outskirts of the city, the Cercadia complex. This remarkably large structure has been interpreted two ways, but both agree that the construction began with imperial backing in the late 3rd or early 4th century. The first interpretation sees this structure as a large palace that was subsequently converted into a smaller Christian complex in the 4th century. The other view asserts that a smaller Christian complex for the local bishop was built up over time to cover the ultimately large footprint of the complex. In either case, the Cercadia complex reflects the importance of religion in the city. In the first interpretation, the original administrative function of the complex becomes linked with religion as the bishop literally fills the place of the old administrators, combining religious and civic power in the city. In the second case, the resources allocated to building a new area for the Bishop of Cordoba by the recently Christian imperial administration illustrates the high religious standing of the Cordoban community. Therefore, both interpretations of the Cercadia complex demonstrate a strong Christian component of the Cordoban identity that has ties to the civic identity as well. The maintenance of public and religious spaces undoubtedly aided in identity formation for those in the city. The public and religious structures in and around the city allowed spaces where inhabitants could engage in placemaking. Placemaking is a process that involves people using their routine interactions with places in their midst to serve as anchors for their community and for their own sense of identity. In the context of Cordoba, for example, the elites shared religion in common with the populace and expressed their religious beliefs in the same locations, such as the martyrial complex of St. Aquisclus. Also, the Roman administrative system left an impression of civic power on the culture of Cordoba. Thus, the ritual practice and social experience of all sectors of the urban population overlapped, which would create a shared sense of identity within the community. Most scholars agree that the Visigoths' rule did not reach southern Spain in the 5th century if their rule extended beyond the northern Spanish regions at all. Scholars usually consider Cordoba to have come under the control of the Visigoths during the reign of King Theodos from 531 to 548, if not earlier. Theodos had married a wealthy Hispano-Roman noblewoman before he established himself in Toledo in central Spain and went on to become king of the Visigoths. The apparent power and reach of Theodos lead many to conclude that he controlled all of southern Spain, including Cordoba. This interpretation largely rests on the assumption that the city was incorporated sometime before 550 into the Visigothic state. Therefore, when the Western Roman Empire ceased to have a presence in Spain in the 460s, the Cordobans possessed the administration, material environment, and power to function independently and had likely done so already at various points throughout the 5th century. The capability to be independent, however, does not demonstrate that the city took this political path. The logical conclusion, though, must be that, if no longer ruled by the empire and not under the domination of a new successor kingdom, the Cordobans ruled themselves in the late 5th century, and their Cordoban identity became their political identity as well. By analyzing the identities involved and maintained in the Cordoban community, the study of Cordoba in the 5th and 6th century fleshes out a new framework for post-Roman Spain. By shifting attention away from larger polities and towards smaller scale communities as driving developments in the political and social situation in the Iberian Peninsula, one sees the new narrative develop. In the case of Cordoba, this leads to the conclusion that the so-called rebellion of the city instead represented the resistance of an independent city. Whether or not one accepts the argument for independence, the investigation of Cordoba reveals the link between identity formation and community building through local administration, local material conditions, and the potential incorporation of people of different identities into a unifying communal identity. Made possible by social interaction and proximity, both common features of an urban environment, a self-awareness of a shared communal identity furthers its cultural power. This is the case especially when reinforced by other identity-shaping factors such as religion. This social power then can be maintained by meeting force with force when necessary. For Cordoba, this community identity centered around a civic identity that fused with the city's religious ties, thereby overcoming potentially divisive identities such as ethnic backgrounds. Furthermore, this Cordoban identity animated the city as it resisted domination from the outside. This method of studying the relationship between identity and power in a community like Cordoba can be applied throughout history and society in different times and places. Thank you for your time. All right, so it looks like I've come in a little under time for my presentation, but I probably need to add in a few more transitions and maybe explain a couple points a little bit better. So that's very good. So thank you for watching this video. Hopefully it wasn't too boring, just listening to a slideshow basically, but you can like and subscribe or leave your comments and questions if you have more. Thanks.